My daughter's barely gone, and you're already throwing me out? I whispered, clutching the eviction notice her husband had slipped under my door. The man who once called me Dad now looked at me like I was a burden he couldn't wait to be rid of. In that moment, grief turned into something colder, betrayal deep enough to scar, and a promise that I would fight back with everything I had. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments make this community special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink. This is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. November in Portland wears a soft gray coat that smells of wet cedar. The morning after my daughter's funeral, rain tapped the metal roof of the backyard ADU I built with my own hands, a metronome for a day that didn't want to begin. Coffee hissed in the small kettle. On the pegboard above the kitchenette, my chisels hung in exact rows, steel catching the dim like a line of watchful eyes. I rubbed the nicked handle of my block plane and told myself to move, to mark a line, to cut another joint square and true, as if the right angle of wood could persuade the rest of my life to hold. Work has always given my mind a place to stand. Even now, square corners feel like a promise that something can still be corrected. The bike on its wall rack hadn't seen the Willamette in weeks. Hospitals teach a different cadence: wait, listen, nod, repeat. And I learned it well beside Lena's bed. She planned her days the way I measure lumber, carefully, with margin. When the pain let up, she sketched timelines in a nurse's notebook and said she wanted recovery to be another grant phase with deliverables and a celebratory potluck. When it's done, I smiled and pretended to believe her, because fathers sometimes borrow faith from their children. Lena was 34 and already the kind of engineer younger staff wanted to become. Boots in mud, spreadsheets immaculate, she believed a river can be coaxed back toward health if you respect the way it bends. There was gentleness in her science, a refusal to bully nature into compliance. She taught me to believe in gradual repair. When the diagnosis arrived with its hard edges, she faced it like a field survey. Honest, thorough, unafraid to mark what was failing. The ADU's small window looks onto a big leaf maple. In those last weeks, we watched squirrels stage arguments across the branches, and the ordinary comedy of it kept us both upright. Brandon, my son-in-law, lives by a different map. He can charm a room in 5 minutes and raise a seed round in 10. Kite Grid, his clean energy startup, speaks the confident verbs of pitch decks: optimize, accelerate, scale. He wears optimism like a tailored suit. In public, he is attentive and smooth. In private, he measures life in quarters. A house needs both beams and wiring, I used to tell myself, but there were days his eyes slid past the human lint of life, the burnt toast, the late bill, the tired laugh, and fixed on a horizon only he could see. The funeral was a small circle in a forest park clearing. Mist stitched itself between Douglas firs. Dr. Maytan, Lena's closest friend, stood with a thermos and the calm gravity of someone who can carry real data and real kindness in the same pocket. Colleagues told stories about hip waders and grant reports, about a woman who would kneel to measure soil moisture and then stay late to help a junior staffer rewrite a methodology section. I had whittled a cedar token the week before, thumb smooth, oval as a river stone. I kept it in my palm through the eulogies the way a child keeps a secret marble. Close, necessary, warming. After the roses were laid down, Brandon took my hand. "I'll take care of you," he said. His eyes were rimmed red. No tears fell. The sentence felt like a brace tacked across a cracked beam. Temporary, maybe, but holding. I nodded. "Thank you," I said. Aisha Kareem, our attorney, and May stood a few steps away speaking softly to the property manager about parking for out-of-town guests. When they looked over, their expressions were gentle, protective even, not alarmed. I chose to read it that way because grief, like rain, is easier to bear when you decide it's feeding something. Back in the ADU that night, the city seemed too large for one man. My wife died 7 years ago, and grief taught me about echoes. They find the corners you didn't know existed. The kitchenette buzzed with the refrigerator's small hum. The tools on the pegboard were still. Rain softened from tap to whisper. I sat at the narrow table facing the maple and thought about Lena's last weeks. She spent long hours with Aisha and with Gordon Lim, the trust administrator. "Keep building the shelves," she told me. "Everything's arranged." It sounded like comfort then. It sounds like intention now. Brandon was kind that week, in his way. He arranged the catering, spoke to Kite Grid's board, shook hands with my union pals at the reception, thanked them for coming, smiled at their stories, even when the punchlines were sawdust dry. When someone asked about plans, he said the right things. "We're going to honor her work," he told a colleague from the Watershed Council. "We'll keep funding Eco-Mend." I watched his mouth form the promise and tried not to let skepticism show. Grief turns easy judgments brittle. I wanted to give his sentence room to stand without testing every fastener. Later, I walked the stepping stones to the main house to fetch a sweater. The entryway smelled of raincoats and lemon oil. Lena's field notebook lay on the console, spine cracked, a pencil tucked at the angle she favored. I ran a finger along the margin notes, tiny arrows, tight abbreviations, and put it back exactly where it had been. In the living room, streetlight pooled across the floor in squares, quilting the rug with pale gold. If I stood still long enough, I could almost hear her laugh, not like a ghost, but like light finding a surface that still remembers it. May stopped by before heading home and left 2 containers of soup on the counter of my ADU. She touched my forearm and told me to sleep. Aisha texted to check in and added that she and Gordon would follow up next week about routine paperwork. The phrase steadied me. Routine is the carpenter's favorite word. If something has a routine, it can be followed. If it can be followed, it can be finished. Close to midnight, the rain slackened and left the air rinsed. The backyard became a dark map. The stone path shone like a thin creek. I set the cedar token on the table and traced its groove with my thumbnail. A brace holds until the permanent fix is ready. We would seal drafts, add blocking, replace what rot had eaten. We would follow the plan Lena said she had made, whatever it was, wherever she had stored it. On the wall, the bike waited like an invitation to ordinary life. Tomorrow, I told it, I'll ride the river path and feel the city unspool. For tonight, I let the rain's patient timekeeping steady the room, the tools, and the breath in my chest. Brandon's promise moved through my head in a slow loop. I allowed myself to believe it for one more evening, long enough to sleep. Somewhere in the rafters of the little house, however, a hairline crack had already formed. No sound yet, only the quiet geometry of stress traveling through wood, choosing its line, preparing the future with perfect patience. If you're still watching and finding this beginning powerful, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to Chapter 2. By late afternoon, the rain turned thin and needling, the kind that slips under a hat brim and collects at the collar. I set a chisel on the waterstone and tried to find the rhythm, push, lift, rinse, repeat, but the steel skated like a skater on black ice. Edge work demands attention. Mine wandered. The ADU hummed with refrigerator breath, gutters chattered along the eaves, and the maple outside shook itself as if shrugging off a question it didn't want to answer. Brandon spread his laptop on the kitchen island, light from a spreadsheet washing his face in calculated blue. Columns of green arrows climbed as if obeying. He used the voice he kept for donors and board members, warm but pitched to forward movement, and gave me a tour of ownership structures and time-sensitive opportunities. He said we should optimize assets before taxes eat the estate. He had already printed forms. The stack rested under my hand, warm and thin as a lie that hasn't cooled. He called the pages technicalities, a word that asked for quick signatures and short memories. Utilities, he said, smart locks, a temporary authorization so he could streamline logistics while I grieved. I felt sweat collect in my palms, though the kitchen was cool. Wood taught me early that a joint forced before the glue cures will fail later with a sound you don't forget. I told him I'd run everything by Aisha. He nodded too easily. Something in his eyes flickered, then smoothed, the way a lake surface does after a thrown stone. I phoned Aisha on speaker. Her voice arrived steady, dry as legal paper, and just as dependable. She told me not to sign anything and to photograph every page, envelope, and postmark. She asked me to log dates and times and who said what, not as ammunition but as scaffolding we could build on if the wind rose. She set a brief meeting for the next day and asked me to forward scans. Process has a way of lowering my pulse. Measure twice, cut once, and between those measures, breathe. I met May at a cafe near the streetcar line, our reflections blurred by steam on the glass. She wrapped her hands around a mug and listened while I described the forms. Her questions were small, precise instruments. When had Lena last met with Aisha? Had Lena shared a final framework? Were there access notes for EcoMend? She asked if I had any recorded message from Lena meant for later. "Do you have a copy of her last plan?" she said. I told her no. She looked out at the rain like a scientist watching early data snap into a trend. Back home, I opened the email account that now routed to me and sat still while the inbox refreshed into a moving field of obligation. There were invoices from a university field lab, microgrant applications for EcoMend, reminders about annual filings. A donation platform pinged about a paused transfer labeled Operational Bridge. Donors had questions waiting for answers. The work kept moving as if Lena were just late to a meeting. Pride warmed the room. Fear thinned it. I wondered how long the patience of systems lasts when no one replies. From the next room, I heard Brandon on a call. He likes the speaker function. It performs confidence. He was telling someone that Lena left everything to her spouse and that the house would list quickly. He said San Diego made sense. "We need proximity to a strategic partner," he said. The sentence carried velocity. Velocity can be a tactic. If you move fast enough, questions can't catch you before the ink dries. I set my phone beside the chisel and watched a raindrop make a slow race down the window. Near dusk, Mr. Dell from next door waved me over to his porch, where the air smelled like wet fur and old paint. He mentioned a late-night gathering at the house. Several cars, boxes carried inside, the distinct rectangle of a printer box hugged against a chest. He told the story like a neighbor trying to be casual and failing. I thanked him and told him what people always tell each other when they want to leave a door open without promising to walk through it. "Good to know," I said. Control has a modern face. My phone's smart lock app showed an administrative change pending. The utility bill notification redirected to a new email that used Brandon's domain. None of it shouted. It all whispered in the tone of software. Polite, quick, almost helpful. A house can be turned into an asset by 1,000 quiet defaults. I stood in the doorway of the main house and felt the difference between ownership and access with the clarity of a draft moving under a door. In the shop cabinet, beneath my late wife's block plane, I found a small flash drive in a plastic sleeve. The label was neat block lettering I could have picked out of a drawer in any lifetime. Winter Plan. My thumb traced the bevel of the plastic. I didn't plug it in. Grief has rituals and superstitions, and one of mine is not to rush a cut you can't unmake. I slipped the drive into the little tin that holds my wedding ring and Lena's first house key and closed the lid with a soft metal click. That night I made a list in carpenter's pencil because the stub feels honest in the hand. Call Aisha, scan forms photograph envelopes, ask Gordon about records, archive the neighbor's recollection, note the utility redirect. Sit with May again, leave space on the page because space invites more truth to arrive. The rain tapped with patience. Somewhere a siren wound down and disappeared. I sharpened the chisel for real this time, raised a clean burr, felt the steel bite and hold. Even edge work can be repair. My phone buzzed. The screen showed a text from Brandon. "Tomorrow, let's discuss the ADU. It's not ideal for our new plans." The phrase found its mark like a cold nail set against grain. I looked at the maple shivering under the lamplight and thought about the way stress lines travel through wood, choosing their path long before you hear the crack. I slid the winter plan into my pocket and left the porch light on, not for welcome but for witness. The house and I listened to the rain and waited for morning. If you're still here and curious about how the struggle is building, comment number 2 below so I know you're following along. Now, let's step into Chapter 3. Morning arrived scrubbed and bright, a hard sun on wet streets that made everything look cleaner than it felt. The ADU doorbell sang its cheerful canned melody and optimism I didn't share. A courier stood on the step with a manila envelope and a practiced half smile. I signed, closed the door, and slit the top with my pocket knife. 14 days, it said. Guest status. Termination of informal arrangement. Owner's redevelopment for a prototype annex. Consolidate occupancy. The language was crisp as a paper cut, and it bled the same way. I laid the envelope flat on the counter and photographed it front and back, then every page on top of the cutting board's maple grain. A file number rode the corner like a badge. An attorney of record I didn't recognize stared up from the letterhead. Outside, gutters clicked and cooled. The sun skipped along the puddles and the stepping stones as if nothing consequential could happen on a day so bright. Brandon appeared in the doorway of the main house with his managerial posture set just so. "This is standard compliance," he said. "Law is law, Calvin. Let's make this painless." He mentioned an authorization Lena had signed that would be formalized shortly. He offered a small stipend if I left early, a figure chosen to sound generous without leaving a trace. I told him Aisha would review everything. "Of course," he said, and smoothed the air with his hand like a maitre d' calming a table. I called Aisha and put the phone on speaker. Her steadiness came through the tiny grill as if she were leaning on the counter beside me. She told me to sign nothing, to photograph every page and envelope, to log dates, times, subject lines, and the names of anyone who spoke. She said to avoid confrontation and to call non-emergency police if access to medication or essentials was blocked. She slotted me into an emergency consult that afternoon. Process is a life raft. I climbed onto it one numbered bullet point at a time. Mr. Dell materialized at the fence line with a nod and a small plastic bag. He had pulled the MSD card from his doorbell camera. Late last night, he said, there were cars idling with their lights off, a printer box carried inside, a flatbed dolly squeaking like a mouse that had learned to curse. Headlamps had flared across license plates and moved on. I thanked him. He shrugged the way old neighbors shrug when they've decided to be the archive nobody asked for but everybody needs. An email landed from the bank. The supplementary card Lena had set up for caregiving purchases was canceled. Utilities showed an administrative transfer pending to an address with Brandon's domain. The Smart Lock app logged a code change with an unfamiliar note. None of it shouted. The day simply drifted a degree toward someone else's weather. By late afternoon, the lock refused my code. I stood with the jacket over my arm while the keypad blinked polite denial. From the porch, Brandon said entry required an appointment. I told him my pills and papers were inside. He suggested tomorrow. I called non-emergency and 2 officers arrived with the soft theater of neutrality. The senior one kept his hands visible and his voice even. Under their supervision, I had 15 minutes to gather medicines, a jacket, and a stack of documents. Brandon watched from the hall, expressionless but alert, as if studying a workflow he meant to automate. Humiliation is fluorescent, too bright, too even, no shadows left to climb into. I slid my prescriptions into a canvas pouch, lifted Lena's field notebook copy from the console, and took the cedar token from the bowl where I'd left it. I hesitated at the shop cabinet. The USB labeled Winter Plan sat under my wife's block plane like a small, sealed fate. I slid it into my pocket, then out again, then back. The clock on an officer's vest blinked seconds. I walked out with 2 duffels while the body cam's red light needled the glass. The driveway's swallowtail of oil stains looked like a diagram of retreat. I loaded the sedan and drove east to Powell, where the motels keep watch in straight lines. Room 108 smelled of chlorine and old weather. The blinds rattled when I breathed too hard. I set my bags on the bedspread and watched the pattern try to remember a summer it never had. Aisha's checklist took over my hands. On the motel desk, I made a grid, the notice and its envelope, the bank text with timestamp, the utilities email, the smart lock logs, the micro SD baggie, a list of witnesses with phone numbers. I photographed each item twice, then again with a pin in frame for scale. I uploaded duplicates to 2 thumb drives and emailed Aisha a compressed archive. Breath found the slow, workable rhythm it uses when wood is planed correctly. I smoothed the desk with the heel of my palm. The laminate had a cupped spot on the right where 1,000 arms had leaned too hard. I didn't fix it, couldn't, but the instinct to locate level, to name plumb, steadied the room. In my notebook, I wrote the day as a sequence: service of notice, conversation, lockout, retrieval, relocation. The sentences were clean and spare. They left just enough space around the facts that the facts could breathe. Lena's voice threaded the quiet the way a thin dowel strengthens a joint. Keep building the shelves. Everything's arranged. Arranged did not mean easy. Arranged meant a path existed if I was willing to walk it without flinching. The motel sign outside flickered from vacancy to nothing and back again. I took the USB from the tin I carry with my wedding ring and Lena's first house key. Winter plan weighed almost nothing and exactly everything. I turned it in my fingers and thought about her block letters on field sample bags, the way she labeled drawers so the future could arrive and not get lost. The meeting with Aisha tomorrow would need all of it. Every scrap, every timestamp, every breadcrumb. The line between deference and consent had been crossed. Evidence would be the handrail now. My phone vibrated on the desk. A text from Brandon stared up in the same confident blue as yesterday's spreadsheet. Reminder, timeline stands. Keys due back with the property manager. I placed the USB on the motel notepad and drew a box around it with carpenter's pencil, the way I lay out a cut I don't intend to miss. Then I turned off the light and let the sign outside keep its patient vigil. Morning would bring the opening of Lena's plan, and with it the first clean edge I could trust. If you're still watching and feeling the tension rising, drop a number 3 in the comments so I know you're walking this road with me. Now, let's move into Chapter 4. Dawn thinned the motel's neon to a tired hum, the kind of half-light that makes every surface look honest. Room 108 smelled like damp carpet and chlorine. I set Lena's flash drive on top of the motel Bible and my carpenter's pencil as if I could balance the day among faith, law, and craft. Then I slid the drive into my old laptop and watched the screen wake with a slow, blue breath. The directory tree appeared with Lena's tidy grid of names: GLT_core, triggers, Aisha_packet, ecomend_governance, video_notes. It felt like opening one of her field kits, everything labeled, no waste. I clicked video_notes first. She looked thinner than the summer before, but her voice was field stable, measured, clear. She explained the Green Legacy Trust she'd created independent of her will, an instrument that redirected distributions to Brandon if and only if he honored basic decency toward me for 12 months after her death. Mistreatment, forced eviction, cutting access, harassment would trigger rerouting to me and to EcoMend. If you need this, she said, I'm sorry. I also trust you to follow the plan. The camera caught her block letters taped to the wall behind her. Chain of evidence. Beneath it, her hand-drawn checklist. I opened PDFS and GLT_core. The trust instrument wore signatures and seals like armor. A summary sheet listed trustee contact, Gordon Lim, and an activation checklist. Document mistreatment, preserve records, notify counsel, request trustee review. In triggers sat a templated incident log, a preservation notice draft, and hash value instructions for digital copies. In Aisha packet, I found a pre-addressed email routine Lena had scheduled if her phone went inactive for 30 days. It had already fired, which meant the ground under us had been arranged to hold. I called Aisha and shared my screen. She didn't waste breath on marveling. She mapped moves. Status quo order to freeze transfers. Temporary restraining order on occupancy changes. Document preservation notices to Brandon, Kite Grid, and vendors. Don't touch originals, she said. Clone the USB twice, record hash values, seal the source. I read back the chain of custody steps while she typed. Her voice shifted when I mentioned Brandon's authorization. We'll have forensics on print metadata and signatures, she said. If they printed anything after Lena's death, we'll see it. I laid the motel desk out like a shop bench. The notice to vacate and its envelope. the bank's text canceling the caregiver card, utility redirects, smart lock logs, the micro SD card from Mr. Dell in a clear bag labeled with date and time. I photographed each item with a pin and frame for scale, then entered them into Lena's chain of evidence template. Item, source, timestamp, relevance, hash, location. The faucet drip kept time. So did the fluorescent ballast buzz. Patience is a kind of muscle. Today, mine remembered how to flex. At the cafe near the streetcar line, steam stitched the windows opaque. May arrived wearing a wool hat the color of wet stone. She slid Lena's project notebook across and tapped a page Lena had flagged FIR in a pencil box frame. 2 covert accounts sat in neat rows with dates and amounts lily-sized to look innocent. Memo lines read like euphemisms. R&D pass-through, field pilot, vendor advance. Money had walked from eco-men to kite grid and bridges that built nothing public. May didn't raise her voice. She folded her hands and kept them there. She asked me to hold this until you needed it, she said. I photographed the page, then asked her to sign a short statement about where, when, and how the page had come to her hands. She dated and signed with a scientist's careful print. Back at the motel, I uploaded the doorbell clip for Aisha's forensic contact. He replied within the hour with a make and model of the printer on the box in Mr. Dell's footage and a likely time window that matched the night before the notice arrived. Aisha moved off speaker to a lower register reserved for opportunity. She drafted a litigation hold demanding cloud print logs, device histories, and draft PDFs from Brandon's systems. If the authorization was born after Lena, she said, "We're not arguing ethics. We're arguing dates." Gordon Lim called from a number that announced itself with understatement. He had received Aisha's preservation notice and outlined the Green Legacy Trust workflow. Initial evaluation for conduct within the clause. Confirmation via documentary record, notice to beneficiaries, then rerouting of designated assets. Behavioral triggers, he reminded me, weren't criminal standards. Preponderance of evidence would guide the trustee. He asked for notarized copies of the notice to vacate, smart lock denial screenshots, and my short affidavit. He spoke like a man who keeps a calculator and a compass in the same drawer. I took the original USB, sealed it in a small envelope, signed across the flap, then slid it into the tin with my wedding ring and Lena's first key. The clones I labeled in thick pencil, GLT_clone_A, GLT_clone_B, then recorded their hash values per Lena's notes. I backed everything up to an external drive and to an encrypted folder Aisha controlled. Finally, I wrote a one-page incident summary in simple sentences meant to survive repetition. The act of writing sanded the day to an even grain. Grief didn't leave. It changed jobs. Instead of flooding rooms, it held the clipboard while we checked boxes. I could hear Lena in the way a piece of stringer hears the rest of the staircase. Present, invisible, load-bearing. She had labeled field samples in those same block letters. She had arranged the future so it would not get lost in someone else's speed. Aisha filed the emergency motions and sent Brandon's counsel a preservation demand that read like an ice bath reminder of consequences. Spoliation, sanctions, production deadlines. She texted me a short list for an afternoon briefing, ID, evidence grid, scans of the FIR page, doorbell card, smart lock logs, and the original notice. "We keep it firm and quiet," she wrote. "The facts will do the volume." My phone vibrated with Brandon's cadence of pressure. "Any cooperation will be noted. Delay only complicates outcomes." The sentence carried the confidence of someone who mistakes speed for power. I turned the phone face down and zipped the folder that held Lena's plan, May's page, and my grid. Outside, rain resumed its steady percussion, the city's own metronome for endurance. I checked the safe twice, pocketed the clones, and stepped into a morning that finally had edges I could trust. The winter plan had moved from rumor to rail, and I followed it toward Aisha's office, where the first collision waited like a test cut on clean wood. If you're still here and sensing the conflict getting deeper, type number 4 in the comments to let me know you're staying with the story. Now let's continue to Chapter 5. Aisha's conference room was all clean lines and rain-slick light, a rectangle of glass looking down on streets polished to a darker shine. The table ran long enough to feel like a runway. Legal pads waited at precise angles. A small recorder blinked a red dot that measured time without sympathy. I set my folder down beside the two labeled USB clones and tried to breathe in fours the way I do before a difficult cut. Mark, saw, pare, test. Aisha sat at the head, calm as a level bubble. To her right, she'd left a space for me. Across the table, Brandon took his seat, phone face down like a concealed blade, and his attorney, a woman named Claire, opened a tablet and uncapped a pen. The trustee, Gordon Lim, chose a chair a little off the center line, as if neutrality were a physical habit he protected with geometry. The room smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and toner, a scent that says everything here is paper until a judge decides otherwise. The recorder clicked. Aisha stated the date and time, the attendees, and the purpose. Preliminary conference concerning conditions of the Green Legacy Trust and preservation of assets. She laid out ground rules. No interruptions. Raised voices get us adjourned, all exhibits identified by number and duplicated on the spot. The red light watched us all agree. We started with the paper trail that brought me to a motel and then to this table. Exhibit A was the 14-day notice to vacate front and back, envelope with postmark and timestamp. The language read like a machine, convinced it could describe mercy, guest status, termination of informal arrangement, redevelopment for a prototype annex. Exhibit B, smart lock denial screenshots and an access log printout that showed code changes with an administrative note from Brandon's domain. Exhibit C, a bank text time-stamped to the minute my caregiver card died. Exhibit D, the utility redirect to his corporate alias. Exhibit E, stills from Mr. Dell's doorbell footage, cars at odd hours, a printer box with its brand readable, a dolly squeaking across wet concrete, headlamps sliding over partial plates. With each page, Aisha named the source and chain of custody, placing copies in a neat stack before Claire and a smaller set before Gordon. The only sound other than the rain was the soft catch and release of the stapler and the mild whir of the climate system. In this room, temperature is part of the argument. Then Aisha read aloud from the summary of Lena's trust. The clauses were plain. For 12 months after her death, any mistreatment toward me, coercive removal, denial of essentials, conduct intended to force me out, constituted a trigger. If triggered, designated distributions assigned to Brandon would be redirected to me and to EcoMend. The trustee would determine by preponderance of evidence. The trust was independent of her will. It sounded less like a threat than a bearing on a compass. If you choose this heading, you will arrive where it leads. Brandon's jaw tightened. He called the notice standard compliance, the lockup dates security best practices, the utility moves efficiency in a difficult time. He said we could have avoided confusion if I had cooperated. Claire added that my guest status made his actions reasonable and that a signed authorization by Lena validated the transition. The words sat on the table like shiny hardware in the wrong size, useful somewhere, not here. Aisha slid a thin folder forward. Inside were preliminary notes from a forensic contact who had examined the stills from Mr. Dell's camera. The printer brand and model on the box, the timestamp range matching the late-night activity, the proximity to the morning the notice arrived. Together they formed the outline of a session when something was printed after the date on Lena's death certificate. Aisha served Claire with a preservation demand, cloud print logs, device histories, draft PDFs, notary information, authentication records, and noticed that sanctions would follow any spoliation. She said evenly that language matters and so do dates. Gordon cleared his throat with the professionalism of a man who keeps separate folders for conscience and procedure. He described his workflow. Compile records, interview parties, align timelines, issue a preliminary determination. He said without ornament that the combination of notice, lockout, card cancellation, and utility redirect met the threshold for a formal trigger review. He requested notarized copies of Exhibits A through D, my short affidavit, and production of the purported authorization within 48 hours. His hands were still, his voice didn't hunt for sympathy. Claire reserved all rights to contest relevance and interpretation. She asked whether the trustee would consider an interim arrangement that acknowledged Brandon's operational needs. Aisha said any arrangement would have to respect the status quo in the trust's language. "We are preserving, not negotiating against a moving target," she said. Her tone remained steady, as if steady were the only weapon worth bringing to this kind of fight. Brandon leaned forward, precision cracking at the edges. He accused me of weaponizing grief, of turning a private transition into spectacle. He said he would accelerate disposition at Kite Grid and implied that if funds moved now, they would be harder to unwind later. I felt the words slide toward threat and stop there. Aisha noted them for the record and added Kite Grid custodians to the litigation hold list with a few keystrokes. In the glass, the red dot on the recorder hung over Brandon's shoulder like a small, patient moon. Humiliation is a current that can carry a person out to sea. Today it reversed and thinned. I counted the steps of a dovetail in my head, mark, saw, pare, test, and let the old metronome steady the present. Under load, the wrong fastener reveals itself. Under record, the wrong story does too. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech. I stacked my breath into usable lengths and held my place. Aisha proposed a follow-up in 72 hours to review document production and for Gordon to report on preliminary findings. Claire said she would confer with her client. Gordon said simply that he was initiating the review now. The recorder clicked as Aisha ended the session for the record. Chairs pushed back. Paper sighed into folders. As we stood, Brandon angled close enough that I could count the flecks in his irises. "Cooperate," he said softly, "or I make this brutal." I kept my hands on the folder and met his eyes. "Truth keeps its own schedule," I said. Outside the window, the rain sharpened as if the city had decided to stop pretending about the weather. The red light went dark. We walked out under a sky that looked ready to rinse everything and leave only what could not be washed away. Gray noon clung to the courthouse annex like a curtain that hadn't decided whether to fall. Inside a windowless mediation room, the lights hummed. A carafe of coffee burned in slow motion. The mediator set ground rules. Voluntary, confidential, aim for resolution. The table was too clean, as if nothing messy could happen on it. Aisha planted the interim line first. Status quo meant exactly what it said. No occupancy changes, no transfers, no creative reclassifications. She centered our packet like a compass. Across from us, Brandon angled his chair so he wasn't quite facing me. Claire, his attorney, rested a tablet on a legal pad, a modern khaki over an old map. Offer one arrived with the rhythm of a press release. Brandon proposed that I vacate the ADU within 2 weeks for $50,000 and a broad waiver extinguishing any claim I might have to assets, governance, or crossovers between EcoMend and Kite Grid. He called it compassion plus efficiency, a clean line through a complicated page. I heard the pitch for what it was, speed masquerading as mercy, and kept my hands flat while Aisha spoke. She declined anything that trimmed the Green Legacy Trust down to convenience. Behavior triggers are behavior triggers, she said, and the trustee was already reviewing a notice to vacate, lockouts, a canceled caregiver card, and redirect emails. We weren't bargaining over weather, we were reading a barometer. My pulse found the cadence I use when marking dovetails. Press the knife, draw the line, breathe. Do not sand away the mark you need to follow. Then Aisha lifted another folder and changed the air. She set a postnuptial agreement on the table, thin consideration, thin ink. Brandon had Lena sign it during treatment. No independent counsel, irregular notarization metadata, timestamps aligned with medication. It promised caregiving and delivered leverage. Aisha explained why it was voidable under basic fairness doctrines. Claire's posture stiffened. Brandon's heel tapped under the table. The mediator shifted to shuttle mode, meeting with each side. In our room, he reviewed risks and the likely schedule. Aisha mapped it cleanly. disclosures within a week, a hearing in roughly 30 days, trustee review on an independent track. He asked how I felt about the strain. Strain isn't a stranger when you build stairs, I told him. You load them gradually, test every tread, and refuse to fake support with caulk. Across the hall, he reality tested Brandon and Claire. We didn't hear their words, but the wall felt a degree softer when they returned. Offer 2 came dressed as compromise, a global pause. Brandon would pay for my temporary relocation if the trustee delayed action, and we dialed the conflict down. Aisha declined. The trust wasn't a faucet to shut because someone found it inconvenient. She offered what the instrument contemplated: strict preservation, my access restored, immediate document production. A judge appeared by video for a brief status conference. Interim orders issued like measured taps of a hammer. Maintain possession as is. No occupancy changes. No asset transfers. Preserve all records. Exchange initial disclosures in 7 days. Dates would rule disputes. Sanctions would arrive swiftly if logs or originals went missing. For a moment, the law felt like a level set on a bowed board in Finding True. During a break, I stood with Aisha in a hallway alcove where a radiator hissed behind painted grating. She asked plainly if I wanted to take money and end it. The question was the right one, and she gave it weight. I remembered Lena's block letters taped to the motel wall, chain of evidence. I remembered her FIR page in May's hands. I remembered the keypad denying my code at the door of a house I helped build. We follow her plan, I said. No waivers. No exits through the gift shop. Aisha nodded once, satisfied not by bravado, but alignment. She filed notice of impasse, confirmed a hearing date a month out, and sent a revised litigation hold to KiteGrid naming cloud print logs, device lists, and notary journals. Gordon emailed that his preliminary trigger review was active. He wanted my affidavit by end of day and reminded us that his work was independent of settlement mood. Outside, rain finally decided to fall. Brandon texted from an angle that tried for altitude. "You're sinking a company for pride." I drafted a reply and erased it unsent. Instead, I forwarded the message to Aisha's folder and added a line to my log. Pride is what you feel when a thing you built stands. This wasn't pride. This was stewardship. Under the courthouse awning, I read the order again. The paper felt less like a shield than a rail. Rails don't protect you. They guide you along a drop you'd rather not look at. I tucked the copy into my folder and stepped into the afternoon. The path ahead wouldn't be comfortable, but it was plumb. For the first time since Lena died, I understood that following her winter plan wasn't just a defense. It was the work left to me, joint by joint, until the house of our promises stood sound. Pewter sky over Portland made the courthouse steps shine like hammered metal. I stood with a thermos and the interim order folded once, the crease crisp as a chalk line. Dates anchor me. I recited them under my breath. Service of notice, lockout, motel night, USB opened, meeting at Aisha's, mediation impasse. Like counting fasteners into a pouch before climbing the ladder. Inside, the day moved in measured clicks, docket numbers called, lawyers rising, papers passing hand to hand. Our hearing was short by design. Aisha filed our initial disclosures, the exhibit list A through E, my chain of evidence grid, hash reports for the GLT clones, and May's signed provenance statement for the page marked FIR. Claire objected on relevance and interpretation, but the judge gave the room a center line. Dates rule, she said, conduct matters. Rolling production within 7 days, no sand in the gears. The gavel wasn't necessary, the tone did the work. We widened the record by inches. Mr. Dell's declaration described cars at odd hours, a printer box with its logo visible, a dolly squeaking across wet concrete. Aisha submitted a bank declaration tying the caregiver card cancellation to a specific minute and a utility statement reflecting the administrative email redirect. The judge called it a pattern of coordinated control moves and allowed it into the preliminary record. Accuracy, not drama, kept our footing. Gordon filed a neutral memo that read like a ledger. He had received the exhibits, aligned a timeline, and concluded that the threshold for formal trigger review under the Green Legacy Trust was met. Interviews with both parties were calendared. He requested notarized copies, a smart lock vendor confirmation, and my affidavit. I signed at the clerk's desk, printing each letter with care as if straight handwriting could steady the page. Aisha's forensic expert nudged the center another inch. Device metadata on a draft PDF lined up with the brand stamped on the printer box captured by Mr. Dell's doorbell. The draft carried a date after Lena's death. Notary journal confirmation was pending. The judge ordered immediate preservation of all cloud print records and directed Brandon to produce the purported authorization within 48 hours. If paper tells one story and dates tell another, she said, we will follow the dates. Outside the courtroom, Reputation decided it wanted a piece. A local business blog pushed a headline that sounded like a warning label. Clean Tech Darling Faces Estate Dispute, Donor Funds Questioned. A limited partner sent a terse email to Claire about governance risk. Aisha secured both as exhibits, not for spectacle but because market impact is part of the pressure profile. Brandon watched his phone more than the bench. Every vibration carved a new worry line along his jaw. The interim order had teeth. That afternoon, a court-approved locksmith met me at the property, read the order, and reset the codes while logging custody changes. The keypad chimed a neutral tone, and I stepped into the ADU with a copy of the order in my pocket like a passport. I moved methodically. Tools, personal files, photographs, medications, labeling boxes with a thick pencil, recording serial numbers, setting aside anything that might be evidence. The little house felt smaller but honest, as if the air had been cleared with a stiff bristle brush. Aisha coordinated with EcoMin's bank to create a trust-controlled escrow for bare operational needs. No discretionary transfers, dual authorization on every dollar, calendared reports. May stepped in as interim program lead to answer donor questions and pause grants pending review. We kept it simple. Written approvals, shared dashboards, no handshakes pretending to be policy. Stewardship is a kind of carpentry. If you can't see the fastener, you shouldn't trust the shelf. Brandon escalated in the way people do when the old lever stops working. He emailed a final request to vacate, as if the order were a suggestion. Aisha filed it as a potential violation and added Kite Grid's internal counsel to the hold notice. The court set a show-cause date for any interference with possession. Each procedural step clicked like a ratchet. It didn't move backward. Late in the day, the third twist arrived on schedule. Because Lena respected calendars even after she left the room. May forwarded an email delivered by one of Lena's automations, policy documents for a life insurance plan with a contingent beneficiary rule. If the primary beneficiary was under investigation for elder mistreatment of me within 12 months of her death, 100% of benefits redirected to EcoMin and a scholarship fund named for my late wife. Aisha called the carrier and confirmed an administrative hold pending documentation. Brandon's last anticipated influx froze on contact. Anger didn't flare this time. It cooled into resolve the way hot glue hardens under a fan, faster and truer. Lena had drawn a series of rails, trust triggers, evidence chains, preservation notices, beneficiary contingencies. My job wasn't to invent anything. My job was to follow the lines she left. Claire floated a quiet back-channel overture. Something about de-escalation, something about creative solutions. Aisha answered that restoration and document production were the only conversations worth having. The trustee's jurisdiction wasn't a dimmer switch. Gordon, on a brief call, said the new documents were relevant to motive and pattern. The trigger review remained conduct-based, but context matters to anyone tasked with choosing a preponderance. By evening, the sky cleared to a thin blue band over the West Hills, and the light made honest work of everything it touched. I inventoried the shop, clamps aligned by size, planes oiled and nested, stones flattened, drawers labeled in block letters that looked like my daughter's. I wrote the final paragraph of my affidavit in plain language. Dates, actions, sources. No adjectives where a timestamp would do. When you build stairs, you don't hide load, you calculate it and choose your stringers accordingly. The max hummed past like a long exhale. I held the square against an edge, watched the bubble settle true, and felt the day take its shape. We hadn't won anything. We had only found the plum. That was enough. Tomorrow there would be more paper, more clicks of the ratchet, and the steady work of keeping a promise by refusing to cut corners you'll have to live with later. In the window's faint reflection, the little house looked like a drawing made with a good ruler. For the first time in months, I believed we could finish to specification. Morning over the Willamette wore the color of primer, a flat gray that promises surface, not finish. I took the bike for a short loop, the first ride since the funeral, and felt my lungs sting in a way that made sense. The river moved with patient authority. When I got back, I wiped the chain, set the pump back on its hook, and unlocked the ADU with the reinstated code. The keypad chimed, and for once the sound didn't feel like permission granted by someone else. I started with the practical work I trust: inventories, photographs, labels, planes out of their socks, serials recorded, edges oiled. Boxes marked in thick pencil: personal, evidence, teaching, stacked square against the wall. I taped a printed copy of the interim order to the inside of the door where only I would see it. A new deadbolt with a real key turned with the quiet I associate with good hardware. Dignity returns in millimeters. The room stopped feeling provisional and started feeling stewarded. At the kitchen table, Aisha and May joined by video to finalize EcoMin's operating protocol. We agreed on dual signatures for any expense, a weekly donor update cadence, and a monthly snapshot to the trustee and the bank. Outbound grants paused except for true emergencies with strict criteria. May drafted a plain English note: acknowledge the review, reaffirm the mission, promise third-party eyes. Keep it human, I said. She nodded. We opened a limited escrow for operations under trust oversight and set reminders that turned dates into rails. May began triaging the inbox, answering students with empathy and timelines, not platitudes. Paper hygiene came next. Aisha engaged a CPA for a narrow-scope review to map EcoMin's inflows and outflows and reconcile them to the bank. I pulled source documents, the invoices, Lena's governance notes, emails that still carried her voice in their subject lines, and scanned, Bates-stamped, and filed them into an index that mirrored her taxonomy. The motel printer had howled. This one hummed at a respectable, even pitch. Stacks squared at the corners. I could feel my breath match the room. Witness prep ran like a short, careful clinic. Mr. Dell, stick to what you saw, not what you think. Bank and utility, declarants, timestamps, systems, no adjectives. May. Provenance of the FIR page and the habits Lena kept when she was healthy. The same habits she used to design a trust for when she wouldn't be. For me, Aisha's mantra was simple: dates and conduct. Let the court supply the adjectives. I wrote my chronology in clean lines and left the edges unrounded. Gordon called to schedule brief interviews. He asked for the smart lock vendor affidavit confirming the integrity of the code change logs. I pulled the vendor contact from the device app and sent it over. He acknowledged receipt of the life insurance contingency documents and noted that while the GLT trigger remained conduct-based, context mattered to any fair determination. He sounded like a ledger given a voice. Aisha filed a motion to maintain status quo and enjoin interference, attaching the locksmith's custody log, the audit engagement letter, and our EcoMin protocol. She built a trial notebook with tabs for facts, timeline, trust, conduct, forensics, remedies, each tab fronted by a one-page executive summary. We read the timeline tab aloud. I corrected 2 entries by 5 minutes. Precision feels like respect, not fussiness, when someone else's work rides on it. Brandon kept trying to change the weather with texts about accelerated deployment at Kite Grid. I drafted replies, then didn't send them. Instead, I logged, screenshotted, time-stamped, and filed, anger composted into clerical fuel. Aisha added the messages to the production list and the retaliation log. We measured our responses by what they could hold up, not by how they sounded in my head. In the shop, I steamed a warped shelf, clamped it flat, and left it overnight, a demonstration for a community class that doesn't exist yet, but will. I sketched a curriculum on a yellow pad for something I started calling Purple Rain Workshop. Safety, measuring, joinery, finishing, a few evenings a month for retirees and students who need a room that smells like work. It felt less like a daydream and more like an appointment I intend to keep. A retired teacher called EcoMend worried her $50 would go to lawyers. May explained the escrow and the review. I took the phone and thanked her, told her we would send a postcard when the first scholarship in my wife's name went out the door. "Please don't forget to eat," she said. I promised I wouldn't. When we hung up, the impulse to hurry drained away. The rails existed so small gifts could reach the right hands without apology. By afternoon, the CPA had a checklist. I had receipts. Aisha rehearsed remedies with me so I would recognize success when it didn't look like triumph. Confirm the GLT trigger, reroute assets as written, permanent injunction on interference, court-approved governance for EcoMend, referral if misappropriation is proven, fees and costs handled by rule. Victory should look like administration, she said, not vengeance. I wrote that sentence on an index card and stuck it in the trial notebook. Night collected low and even. I closed the binder and set a square on top like a paperweight. On a sticky note, I wrote tomorrow's sequence. Mark saw, pare test, then install. The room was quiet, not empty. Outside, the river kept moving under a sky that chose not to promise anything it couldn't keep. Inside, order held. We had turned defense into repair without pretending the work was done. The case was ready to step into judgment. So was I. Morning light turned the courthouse marble soft as ivory, and for once the rain held its tongue. I carried the tabbed trial notebook the way a carpenter carries a level. Useful, steadying, not theatrical. The square rode on top like an anchor. Inside, the clerk called our case, and the judge arranged her papers as if aligning a cut. She recited where we stood. Interim orders in place, exhibits admitted, trustees memo filed, forensics pending, rolling production underway. She set the standard, preponderance of evidence for a behavior trigger, and reminded both sides that preservation is an order, not a suggestion. Findings arrived without flourish, which made them feel more true. The court found that Brandon served a 14-day notice to vacate, changed the smart lock codes to deny me access, canceled the caregiver card Lena had set up, and redirected utilities to his corporate alias. All within weeks of her death, all aimed at removing me. Forensic preliminaries suggested the so-called authorization was printed after Lena's date of death. Notary irregularities remained unresolved. The judge called it a pattern of coordinated control moves inconsistent with the decedent's caretaking goals. No adjectives I could have chosen would have done better. The conclusions followed like a clean line on planed wood. The Green Legacy Trust stood as a valid instrument independent of the will. The behavior clause was enforceable. By a preponderance of evidence, the trigger had been satisfied. Any post-nuptial agreement Brandon produced was voidable for lack of independent counsel and coercive context. The court declined to credit it. Then came the orders, the rails that matter. Trigger confirmed. Designated distributions assigned to Brandon were rerouted per the trust to me and to EcoMend. A permanent injunction barred him from interfering with my possession, access, or evidence. Violations would answer to contempt. Production and preservation deadlines were set with the chill of accountability. The court approved EcoMend's escrow protocol and authorized a limited operations budget. Fees would follow the trust's enforcement clause. Discovery lapses would cost him money, not just sleep. Gordon rose with a brief, ledger-precise statement. As trustee, he issued a formal determination that conduct met the clause. Rerouting instructions had been transmitted to custodians. Monitoring would continue for 12 months with quarterly reports to the court. He noted the life insurance contingency as context. It sounded like arithmetic, and that felt exactly right. Claire reserved the right to appeal particular findings. She said they would comply with immediate orders to avoid contempt. Brandon didn't look at me. His phone stayed face down for once. I realized standing there that I had been breathing the dovetail sequence, Mark saw pare test, without noticing. The next step was install. Administrative justice moved quickly once the gavel-free decision finished speaking. At the bank, rerouting processed while a manager double-checked account numbers. The title company placed transfer holds where the trust demanded them. Men's escrow received its first controlled tranche for operations. May texted a screenshot of the balance with a single checkmark. The locksmith filed a final custody affidavit. The smart lock vendor's confirmation landed in our index like a square clicking true. I signed trustee-approved paperwork and watched signatures become instructions the world would obey. The outside world noticed. A donor blog shared our plain English update. Replies arrived with more relief than outrage. We sent 2 lines to local press about the first scholarship in my wife's name, and then we went back to work. I prefer hammers to headlines. By late afternoon, I stood in the ADU and slid the signed order behind the Trust tab of the notebook. The square went back to its drawer. I oiled a plane, set it in its slot, and walked the rooms the way I used to walk a job site at day's end, hand on the frame, shoulder against the jamb, listening for complaints. The house spoke in the small language of settled things. Hinge quiet, latch true, floor steady. I am old enough to know that quiet is earned. May came by with a printed draft of the scholarship announcement. No legalese, just names, dates, the purpose written in Lena's kind of clarity. We adjusted a comma and chose a photo that showed hands, not faces, a trowel, a notebook, a sapling. "This feels right," May said. I nodded. Right isn't victory. Right is alignment. On my way home from the bank, I stopped at the community center. I filed a business license for a small workshop that would open evenings and weekends. Purple Rain Workshop looked reasonable in black ink. The clerk stamped the application with a sound I liked. I posted a sign-up sheet at the library. Simple classes, sliding scale, retirees welcome, students encouraged. Real life insists on finding you even when you're wearing a suit. Night finally gave the city back its rain. In the shop, the air smelled of oiled steel and pine, the 2 scents that taught me about permanence. I wrote 3 lines for tomorrow on a yellow sticky: scholarship letter, post. Workshop, clamps list. Eco-Mend, report. Then I sat a while and let my shoulders drop. We hadn't won a story. We had installed a structure. Rails over thunder, as Aisha would say. The work ahead was administration, not revenge, and it would take all the steadiness I could bring. That suited me. A good staircase doesn't make a speech, it holds. Claire reserved the right to appeal particular findings. She said they would comply with immediate orders to avoid contempt. Brandon didn't look at me. His phone stayed face down for once. I realized standing there that I had been breathing the dovetail sequence. Mark saw Pero test without noticing. The next step was install. Administrative justice moved quickly once the gavel-free decision finished speaking. At the bank, rerouting processed while a manager double-checked account numbers. The title company placed transfer holds where the trust demanded them. Men's escrow received its first controlled tranche for operations. May texted a screenshot of the balance with a single checkmark. The locksmith filed a final custody affidavit. The smart lock vendor's confirmation landed in our index like a square clicking true. I signed trustee-approved paperwork and watched signatures become instructions the world would obey. The outside world noticed. A donor blog shared our plain English update. Replies arrived with more relief than outrage. We sent 2 lines to local press about the first scholarship in my wife's name, and then we went back to work. I prefer hammers to headlines. By late afternoon, I stood in the ADU and slid the signed order behind the Trust tab of the notebook. The square went back to its drawer. I oiled a plane, set it in its slot, and walked the rooms the way I used to walk a job site at day's end, hand on the frame, shoulder against the jamb, listening for complaints. The house spoke in the small language of settled things. Hinge quiet, latch true, floor steady. I am old enough to know that quiet is earned. May came by with a printed draft of the scholarship announcement. No legalese, just names, dates, the purpose written in Lena's kind of clarity. We adjusted a comma and chose a photo that showed hands, not faces, a trowel, a notebook, a sapling. "This feels right," May said. I nodded. Right isn't victory. Right is alignment. On my way home from the bank, I stopped at the community center. I filed a business license for a small workshop that would open evenings and weekends. Purple Rain Workshop looked reasonable in black ink. The clerk stamped the application with a sound I liked. I posted a sign-up sheet at the library. Simple classes, sliding scale, retirees welcome, students encouraged. Real life insists on finding you even when you're wearing a suit. Night finally gave the city back its rain. In the shop, the air smelled of oiled steel and pine, the 2 cents that taught me about permanence. I wrote 3 lines for tomorrow on a yellow sticky: scholarship letter, post. Workshop, clamps list. Eco-Mend, report. Then I sat a while and let my shoulders drop. We hadn't won a story. We had installed a structure. Rails over thunder, as Aisha would say. The work ahead was administration, not revenge, and it would take all the steadiness I could bring. That suited me. A good staircase doesn't make a speech, it holds. The first scholarship check went out that morning, my wife's name spelled in a font we chose because it didn't try to be elegant. It was readable like the way she spoke. May took a photograph for the record and for donors who had asked to see where their small bills went when they left a wallet. Holding the envelope, I remembered my wife's looping handwriting on grocery lists. Apples, flour, don't forget the good coffee. It wasn't grief exactly. It was continuity, an action that bridged memory without embalming it. Eco-Mend's rails held. The monthly reporting template was simple and honest. Balances, inflows, outflows, a note about any pauses or exceptions, dates on every line. Donor replies trickled in like careful rain. A retired teacher mailed another $20 taped to a sticky note that read, "Keep going." We didn't measure health by millions. We measured by trust restored, the same way you test a joint with an open hand and not a hammer. At 2 o'clock, the first class arrived. 4 retirees with careful eyes and 2 students who looked like they'd borrowed confidence from their bus passes. We introduced ourselves with names, not resumes. I started with the dovetail because it's the one joint that tells the truth about your patients. Mark saw Perry test, then install. I said, the sentence sitting in my mouth like a prayer I hadn't known I'd been saying for months. A man named Roy cut too fast and split a tail. He winced. I showed him how to read the grain, how to feel the saw set itself. Slow is smooth, I told him, and smooth is fast enough. Between cuts, a woman in a blue cardigan asked if all that court business had ended. The rails are set, I said, and left it there. Dialogue belongs to teaching. The rest lives better in paperwork and minutes. We paired shoulders, checked for square, and clamped pairs together to let glue teach us one more slow lesson about time. When the room emptied, I sat on a stool and let the day settle. What happened to me could have turned into a story about anger, and some days nearly did. But Lena left rails, trust documents with behavioral triggers, a chain of evidence template, a beneficiary contingency with teeth, and the choice was to stomp or to walk. I nearly failed that choice. Rage is easier than record keeping, shouting feels more active than scanning receipts. But dates and conduct kept me upright. The way a line snapped true keeps your next cut from wandering toward regret. I think about people my age who find themselves suddenly disposable, or worse, invisible. The tools change, but the pattern repeats. A son-in-law with speed for morals, a boss who confuses youth with clarity, a system that will let you drown if you don't learn its tide tables. We are not relics. We carry memory and craft. Rails exist even when the track is buried. Trusts, audits, affidavits, community witnesses, paper that can't be shouted off the page. Use them. Don't let volume bully your sense of what's square. Precision is its own kind of strength. May texted a photo from the post office, our envelope sliding behind the blue lip of the chute, and a second shot of the donor email going out with its plain subject line, "Update and thanks," no exclamation points. Just names, dates, what we did, and what we'll do next. She added, "Eat something." I laughed and warmed leftover soup on the shop hot plate, the basil rising into the air like a reasonable argument. Outside, children's laughter ran past the open door, a quick river of sound that left the street a little cleaner for having carried it. I oiled a small plane and set it down, edge-guarded, throat clear. The square rested on the bench as a reminder that alignment isn't a moment, it's a practice. Before locking up, I wrote 3 lines on a sticky note for tomorrow. Postcard to donor. Workshop cut list. Eco-Mend review. The list looked small, which is how good lists look when a day has been designed to hold them. Evening gathered without drama, rain soft enough to be companionable. The shop glowed the way a room glows when work has been done and put away correctly. We hadn't toppled a villain. We had installed a structure and agreed to maintain it. Justice found us not with thunder but with rails, measured, administrative, humane. I can live with that. In fact, that is exactly how I intend to live. By rails, by squares, by letters sent on time, by classes that teach hands to tell the truth. I turned off the light and let the smell of pine and oil linger, a quiet benediction that felt like permission to continue. In the end, justice didn't thunder in. It arrived on rails, deliberate steps, dated facts, and steady hands choosing stewardship over spectacle. Grief softened into purpose, and purpose became practice. Protect what's true, document what's real, and build systems that outlast moods. When power rushes, pace yourself with process. When noise swells, let precision speak. Integrity is rarely loud, but it holds like a well-cut joint. Mark, saw, pair, test, then install. The work of repair is not glamorous. It is patient, transparent, and accountable. And that is enough. If this story resonated, add your voice below. What moment stayed with you and why? Your reflections help others find meaning here. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join us for more journeys of resilience, fairness, and quiet courage. Thank you for watching, for thinking alongside us, and for believing that careful, humane choices still matter. And if you know someone who needs this reminder, share it forward. The right story at the right time can steady a life.